Liang Xun and Dr. Henry Lawton. One was a rising star in neuroscience, the other a respected professor who had built his career on integrity. Their names should have been linked by groundbreaking discoveries, but instead they became connected by something far darker: murder. When Dr. Lawton's body was discovered in a research lab freezer, frozen alongside biological samples, the academic world was shaken. But the real shock came when investigators uncovered the truth. Liang Xun, a brilliant PhD student obsessed with success, had orchestrated it all. What drove a promising scientist to commit the ultimate crime? The answer lay in a web of deception, ambition, and deadly desperation. Liang Xun arrived in the United States with a singular purpose: to earn his PhD in neuroscience and secure a future as a respected scientist. Growing up in a small town in China, he had spent his entire life being told that success was the only thing that mattered. His parents, both retired school teachers, had sacrificed everything to ensure he had the best education possible. To them, academic achievement was more than just a goal. It was survival. Crescent State University was not an Ivy League school, but it was respected in the field of neuroscience. Liang had chosen it because of its well-funded research labs and the guidance of Dr. Henry Lawton, a renowned scientist known for pushing his students to the limit. Liang thrived in this environment. His days started before sunrise and ended well past midnight. He rarely spoke to anyone outside of his research group. Socializing, to him, was a distraction. He was there to prove he was the best. At first, his work progressed steadily, but competition within the department was fierce. His peers were brilliant, and among them was Alan Drucker, an American student whose research on neural regeneration was attracting attention. Alan had an easygoing demeanor that concealed a sharp intellect. He made breakthroughs effortlessly, publishing papers that gained traction in the academic world. Liang watched as Alan received praise from faculty members and invitations to conferences. He convinced himself that Alan had an advantage: connections, luck, something that made things easier for him. It wasn't fair. As the semesters passed, Liang started to feel the weight of expectation crushing him. His experiments were not producing significant results. The data was inconsistent, and his findings were unremarkable. He couldn't afford failure. His funding, his visa status, and his reputation all depended on his success. Returning to China as a failed PhD student was not an option. He imagined the disappointment in his parents' eyes, the whispers of neighbors who had once admired him. He needed to get results, no matter what. Late one night, alone in the lab, Liang made a small decision that would change everything. He adjusted a data set to make the results appear stronger. It was just a minor tweak, he told himself. The conclusions were still valid, the science was still real. But when he presented his findings to Dr. Lawton, the reaction was immediate. His professor was impressed, calling the results promising. Encouraged by the praise, Liang continued making small manipulations. He removed anomalies, exaggerated patterns, refined numbers. Each adjustment brought more recognition. His name began to appear in research papers, and his work was cited by others in the field. But success had a cost. The more Liang fabricated, the harder it became to keep track of the lies. He felt the pressure growing, the fear of being exposed gnawing at him. Yet, even as doubt crept into his mind, one thought remained clear. He was finally getting the recognition he deserved, and he would do whatever it took to keep it. Liang's fabricated results spread quickly through academic circles, drawing attention far beyond what he had anticipated. His research on neural regeneration was being hailed as groundbreaking, a potential game-changer in the field. The department was receiving calls from prestigious institutions interested in collaboration. Dr. Henry Lawton, once known for his critical approach, had become Liang's strongest supporter, boasting about his star students' contributions. Funding agencies began showing interest, and suddenly Liang was being invited to present his work at major conferences. At first, it felt like validation. His entire life had been spent chasing this moment, the respect of his peers, the approval of his mentors, the possibility of securing a future at the top of the academic world. But beneath the surface, panic was setting in. His research was built on lies, and in science, lies had a way of unraveling. As more researchers attempted to replicate his findings, they began to encounter problems. Their results did not align with Liang's published work. Some assumed they had made mistakes, but others started questioning the legitimacy of his studies. Alan Drucker had been skeptical from the start. He had worked alongside Liang for years and knew how difficult the research was. It struck him as odd that Liang's breakthroughs had come so suddenly. He decided to test Liang's methodology by recreating the experiment himself. After weeks of effort, he failed to achieve the same results. He ran the tests again, still nothing. Alan voiced his concerns to Dr. Lawton, but his professor dismissed them without hesitation. Liang's work had brought prestige to the department, and Dr. Lawton saw no reason to doubt him. Alan, however, refused to let it go. He gathered data from other labs attempting similar research and found a troubling pattern. No one was able to replicate Liang's results. Alan wasn't the only one growing suspicious. A visiting professor, Dr. Evelyn Hayes, had recently joined Crescent State University for a research collaboration. She had spent years investigating scientific misconduct and knew how to spot red flags. She reviewed Liang's publications and noticed inconsistencies in his data. Some figures seemed too perfect, others too convenient. Her instincts told her something was wrong. One evening, Dr. Hayes approached Liang in the lab. She calmly pointed out the irregularities in his data and asked him to explain. He remained composed, thanking her for her feedback and promising to review his findings. But as soon as she left, Liang felt his stomach tighten. He knew she wouldn't let this go. If she dug deeper, she would find everything. That night, while walking back to her apartment, Dr. Hayes was struck by a speeding car. The vehicle never stopped. She survived, but suffered a concussion and multiple fractures. The police investigated but found no leads, no witnesses, no security footage, nothing to identify the driver. The timing was unsettling, but without evidence, no one could prove it was anything more than a tragic accident. Alan, however, refused to believe it was a coincidence. He intensified his efforts, determined to expose the truth, but he had no idea how dangerous that decision would be. Alan Drucker knew he was onto something, but proving it was another matter. With Dr. Hayes recovering in the hospital and unable to continue her investigation, the responsibility of exposing Liang fell squarely on Alan's shoulders. He spent long hours in the lab, carefully reviewing past experiments, cross-referencing published results, and examining raw data. The more he dug, the clearer the pattern became. Liang's findings were not just flawed. They were deliberately manipulated. Alan decided to gather concrete evidence before confronting anyone. One night, after ensuring the lab was empty, he accessed Liang's computer using a lab technician's login credentials. What he found was damning. Several versions of the same dataset had been saved with slight alterations, each one making the results look progressively more impressive. Some files contained unedited raw data, which told a very different story from the polished figures Liang had published. It was undeniable proof of fraud. The discovery filled Alan with a strange mix of satisfaction and dread. He had the truth in his hands, but what would happen next? Would the university take action, or would they protect Liang to avoid a scandal? As he copied the files onto a flash drive, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Days later, Alan returned to his apartment to find the door slightly ajar. His stomach clenched as he stepped inside. The place had been ransacked, drawers pulled open, papers scattered across the floor, his desk overturned. His laptop, where he had backed up the files from Liang's computer, was missing. A cold realization washed over him. This wasn't a random burglary. Someone had known exactly what to look for. Allen reported the break-in, but with no signs of forced entry and nothing else of value stolen, the police dismissed it as an ordinary case of theft. He knew better. The message was clear. Someone was willing to go to great lengths to keep Liang's secret safe. Meanwhile, Liang was growing increasingly paranoid. Every conversation, every glance in the hallway felt like an accusation. He knew Allen was suspicious, but without evidence, there was little he could do. Still, Allen's persistence was dangerous. If he kept digging, it was only a matter of time before he found another way to expose the truth. Then, the situation took another turn. A new research team from a rival university published a study that cast serious doubts on Liang's work. Their results contradicted his findings, calling into question the legitimacy of his entire research. The academic community began to whisper. Some defended Liang, arguing that discrepancies were common in scientific research. Others were less forgiving. Dr. Lawton, once Liang's biggest supporter, now seemed uneasy. If Liang's research was discredited, it wouldn't just destroy his career, it would taint the department's reputation. He called Liang into his office for a private meeting, demanding a retraction of the flawed papers before the situation spiraled out of control. But before that could happen, Dr. Lawton disappeared. Dr. Henry Lawton's absence was first noticed when he failed to show up for a faculty meeting. At first, his colleagues assumed he was sick or had taken an unannounced day off. But when he missed his lectures and didn't respond to calls or emails, concern turned into alarm. The university contacted the police, who visited his home, only to find his car in the driveway and his phone inside, untouched. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle. It was as if he had simply vanished. The department was in chaos. Liang Xun observed the growing panic with a detached calm. His world had been unraveling, but now something had shifted. For the first time in weeks, the pressure that had been suffocating him seemed to lift. The questions about his research, the threats to his reputation, all of it had momentarily faded into the background. With Dr. Lawton missing, there was no immediate demand for a retraction, no immediate threat to his career. Alan Drucker, however, was more determined than ever. Dr. Lawton had been the only faculty member willing to listen, and now he was gone. Alan refused to believe it was a coincidence. He had been working on exposing Liang, and now the one person who could have forced a confession had disappeared without a trace. Alan was certain that Liang had something to do with it. The campus police increased their efforts, and students whispered theories in hushed voices. Some believed Dr. Lawton had fled to avoid scandal, while others feared something far worse had happened. But the truth would not remain hidden for long. 4 days after his disappearance, a janitor working late in the neuroscience building opened a storage freezer used for preserving biological samples. Inside, he found Dr. Lawton's body. The discovery sent shock waves through the university. The autopsy revealed that he had been injected with a lethal dose of a rare neurotoxin, one that paralyzed the body while leaving the victim fully aware of their surroundings. The toxin wasn't something an ordinary person could acquire, but it was something a neuroscientist studying neural regeneration would have knowledge of. Investigators quickly turned their attention to the department's labs, and soon, all eyes were on Liang Xun. When questioned, Liang remained composed, denying any involvement. He provided a carefully crafted alibi, explaining that he had spent the evening working alone in his apartment. But Alan knew better. He had spent years working alongside Liang, watching the way he meticulously planned every step of his research. Liang was not the type to leave things to chance. If he had committed murder, he would have ensured that no evidence could directly link him to the crime. But as investigators combed through the lab's records, they found something chilling. A batch of the same neurotoxin used in Dr. Lawton's murder had recently gone missing. The only person who had access to that particular storage was Liang. The noose was tightening, and this time, There would be no escape. The discovery of Dr. Lawton's body turned the university into a crime scene. Police locked down the neuroscience department, questioning faculty, students, and lab staff. The news spread quickly, making national headlines. A respected professor murdered, his body hidden in a storage freezer. It was the kind of scandal that could ruin the university's reputation for years. Liang Xun watched the chaos unfold with an eerie calm. He knew the evidence was closing in on him, but he had prepared for this moment. He had always planned several steps ahead, and now he was ready to disappear. That evening, while investigators were still processing the lab, he wiped his computer, removed all traces of his research, and slipped away from campus. By the time authorities realized he was missing, he was already gone. His apartment was empty. His bank account had been drained days before. Security footage from a nearby bus station showed him boarding a bus heading out of state, but after that, the trail went cold. He had vanished. The police issued a nationwide manhunt, and the FBI got involved, believing he might attempt to flee the country. They tracked his digital footprint, but Liang had taken precautions. He had abandoned his phone, stopped using his credit cards, and avoided security cameras whenever possible. His disappearance was so well executed that investigators suspected he had planned it long before Dr. Lawton's death. Then, 2 months later, a breakthrough came. A tip from an anonymous source led authorities to a storage unit in a small town near the U.S.-Mexico border. Inside, they found something far more disturbing than just evidence of Liang's whereabouts. The unit contained vials of experimental neurotoxins, forged documents, and stacks of research notes detailing potential future targets. Investigators found surveillance photos of Alan Drucker and Dr. Evelyn Hayes, both marked with red circles. Liang had been watching them, planning his next moves. The unit also contained a crude disguise kit, hair dye, fake identification, and a map showing possible escape routes into Mexico. It was clear that Dr. Lawton had not been the only intended victim. Liang had been preparing to eliminate anyone who threatened his academic reputation. The discovery reignited the search. Days later, authorities finally tracked him down in a remote town in Mexico, attempting to purchase a ticket for a flight to Shanghai. He was arrested on the spot. When extradited back to the U.S., he showed no signs of fear or remorse. He remained silent throughout the trial, listening to the evidence pile up against him. The jury took just 3 hours to convict him of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. When given the chance to speak before sentencing, Liang simply adjusted his glasses, looked at the judge, and said, "I did what I had to. In the end, I was still the best." He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even behind bars, his name remained infamous, not as a brilliant scientist, but as a cautionary tale of ambition turned deadly.